customers, when they choose who to buy from, things like sustainability, but also cybersecurity will actually influence their decision making. Will my data be safe with the supplier that I'm about to buy something from? Because I'm going to give them potentially quite a bit of data, for example. So I think you kind of need to look on that side as well and treat it as a bit of a revenue growth opportunity as well.
Welcome to a special edition of In the Spotlight with Quocirca, brought to you in partnership with Microsoft Universal Print. We're exploring the impact of technology innovation on the print industry in today's era of artificial intelligence. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Jason Cort from Sharp Europe, where we'll be exploring the trends around cybersecurity and SMBs. So welcome to the show, Jason. Great to have you here today.
Yes, hi Louella, it's great to be here too. So thanks for the invitation. Just for the audience, in terms of a bit more about who I am. So I've been with Sharp Electronics Europe for just over 10 years now, and I'm the European Director for Product Planning and Marketing in the B2B technology services business.
Okay, well, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Cool.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. A staggering 43% of cyber attacks are targeted at SMBs, and typically SMBs have limited resources and budgets, and they're becoming increasingly attractive targets for cyber attackers. What do you think are the main reasons for this vulnerability? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, there's some scary numbers there as well. So hopefully there'll be a lot of people paying attention to this. But I'd really group it into four areas. So there are a lot of things, but there's probably four key groupings. The first one would really be around limited resources, because we're talking about small to medium businesses here, not large enterprises. Which means that they can't really afford to invest in cybersecurity specialists in their organisation. Again, the technology infrastructure to prevent those cyber attacks, again, is costly. So again, they probably won't have that. And also the process of continuous monitoring, because these attacks never stop. The technology never stops. So you need to be continually monitoring. Second one, really lack of awareness as well. In terms of both the cybersecurity threats that exist out there, because there are many different types of cybersecurity threats. And not only that, they're changing all the time. So that's really difficult to be aware and stay aware of those things, which potentially then makes them more vulnerable to different types of attacks. And in actual fact, from some research that we did as Sharp, I think it was over a third of the businesses that we surveyed admitted to actually having been victim to some form of malware or Trojan horse or phishing attack and data loss. So it's real and it's happening. The third kind of grouping I would talk about really is about outdated technology as well. And we just mentioned about investing in technology, but even if you've invested in the technology, then keeping it up to date with the latest security patches and firmware versions, it all takes time and effort. So again, that is really difficult, often gets neglected. So again, vulnerabilities that didn't exist could actually open up over time. So sort of three of the key ones there. But and the last one, which is an interesting one, focus on core business. So an SMB will focus on its core business. Of course it will. That's why they're in business. But it's the neglect of other things, and cybersecurity is often one of them. So again, they just make themselves more vulnerable because of that. So when you look at all of that together, that's why they're attractive to cyber criminals.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, if they've got limited resources and limited budget, it puts them at a disadvantage and makes them more attractive targets to cybercrime and cyber attackers. And you mentioned some of the common attack vectors there, such as phishing and so on. Could you share more on the specific type of cybersecurity attacks that SMBs are facing? Yeah, for sure. We've heard about a lot of the weaknesses that SMBs have. And actually, it's those weaknesses together that make them very attractive to cyber criminals versus the large enterprises, which are tougher nuts to crack. The prizes might be bigger, but certainly need a lot more effort. Versus all these small to medium businesses, where the cyber criminals can use sort of mass market cyber attack vectors and technologies and skills. So it really becomes sort of an automated numbers game as far as they're concerned. Yeah. So actually, if you do have a breach as a small to medium business, generally it's not because they've just singled you out. Yeah, you just happen to have a vulnerability that their automated tools detected.
So what are those types of vulnerabilities and attack vectors then? So phishing attacks, really common and on the increase all the time. And this is where you would get an unsolicited email. It looks like it's come from a company or supplier that you may well actually recognize. And it might be asking for some information. It all looks pretty innocent. And so you may well respond to that. But now you're actually giving away information. And quite often it could be confidential information as well, which the cyber criminal will then use to their advantage. Yeah. Another category of attack vectors involves AI, which has actually been used for quite a few years, even by cyber criminals. So, how would that be used? Well, they can create sounds, they can create audio tracks, they can create video, put it all together, and actually they can create what appears to be a communication from real people or events that are happening, and actually none of it's really happening. So we kind of call these deep fakes, and they've been used to influence political elections and things like that. So that's another really good example that people have to look out for. And then there's the more traditional ones that have probably been around since the year dot, which are malware, ransomware, those types of attacks, where basically the purpose of these things is to encourage or to get the recipient to click on a link that will run a program. And then that piece of malware or ransomware will basically encrypt your data on your laptop or on your server, or it'll block you from logging into those systems. And what do you do now? And that's where the ransomware comes in, because then these cyber criminals then demand an amount of money, which you can choose to pay or not. The advice is whatever you don't pay it. But sometimes businesses will pay it because they feel that's the only way they can get their data back, because their business can't run without data. And Trojan email attacks as well as another example where, again, there's malicious code embedded in it. If you click on it, it will do something that's not going to be good for your business. There's also another interesting category, actually, which is around business email compromises. And people may well have read about these, where, again, they get an email and it's from a supplier they recognise. It might be from the CFO or accounts receivable or payable, something like that. And often it's asking you to authorise the release of funds to such and such a bank account. And people do it. They send the money. And actually it wasn't real, and you've now just sent the money to a cyber criminal that you're never going to get back. So again, beware of those. And coming back to AI, Gen AI now is the talk everywhere. And really with Gen AI and its ability to scrape the whole internet and collect data that might be about your business, it might be about you as a person. And with that data, it can create an email or a video or something that looks so authentic that you could not tell it from the real thing. And so you will probably quite naturally respond to that. Unlike the older ones where, the language is like in Spanglish and, it's a poorly scanned logo and things like that, which are quite easy to spot. But actually, that's really no longer the case.
And I think that's the real impact now, is the use of AI for social engineering. And it's like those examples you shared can seem so genuine when you're receiving an email from a potentially genuine supplier. And I think SMBs, if they do click on that email, it can be potentially devastating to their business if they have to pay ransom and so on. So I think it has a huge impact, and it's not just financial losses and reputational damage and operational disruption effectively for these small businesses, but there's also the regulatory landscape, which is having an impact. And can you share what you're seeing in terms of the key regulations that are affecting SMBs today?
Yeah, for sure. It's really interesting, and I think an important word there is changing, and it's changing in a number of ways actually for all businesses. And one is it's becoming broader, so there's a broader range of regulations, whether it's related to cybersecurity, GDPR, data protection, but even things like sustainability now. So that makes it more challenging and there's more work. But not only that, existing regulations that are in the marketplace, there's then version 2. So we have NIS2, for example, and that's asking even more of the business or the small to medium business to actually do. So when you look at the demands that are being placed on SMBs from a regulatory point of view, it can be overwhelming. I really do feel for those businesses, and the risk is then they don't do anything because they don't know what to do or where to start. So if we look at things like GDPR and data protection, so actually that's been legally in effect now for 4 years. So that's quite a long time, but actually everyone was given a couple of years warning, so it's been around for 6 years. But still, I think many businesses don't fully understand it or maybe haven't fully implemented it and so on. So they're exposed, against the authorities, or if there was a complaint or something like that. So you've got that to contend with. And I'm sure new regulations will come out in that respect as well. There's also then the NIS2 directive. So that's the Network Information Systems 2 directive, which follows on from NIS. And it's a directive that applies to the European Union. So that now excludes the UK. And it categorises businesses into either essential entities or important entities. So an essential entity is a business that's related to banking, energy, transport, and sort of critical infrastructure types of businesses. So really, really important. Then you've got important entities, actually, which then relate to things like waste management, food, and actually the provision of digital services. So when you put those together, that's quite a big catch-all, really. But maybe some relief. It only applies to businesses with 50 or more employees. But again, that's still a lot of businesses, and probably some of the businesses will be listening to us today on that. And essentially what it's now requiring businesses to do is to have conducted a cybersecurity assessment, essentially. Then with that assessment to actually put a plan in place to improve their cybersecurity, and then reassess it again, and then have this continuous loop of improvement. And it's all good things. It's the right things to do. But if you're that small or medium business, it just gets harder in terms of resourcing and all those other things that we mentioned. UK, though, they don't get away with it. So there's also the Cyber Essentials regulations as well. So very similar to NIS too, but something from the UK government, which again, UK businesses have to comply with. And just moving beyond cybersecurity, I touched on it a little bit, but from a sustainability point of view, there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which came into effect in January of this year. So now businesses have to comply. Those regulations initially are really targeted sort of at large enterprise and major accounts. So as an SMB, you're kind of okay at the moment. However, there is intent for the European regulators to extend that down to capture more and more smaller businesses. So it's coming your way, like it or not. So as I say, I really do feel for small businesses having to operate in these what are becoming highly regulated environments.
Yeah, definitely sounds like that regulatory landscape is becoming so much more complex, and like you say, for SMBs to address that and be ready can be quite challenging and overwhelming. I just wanted to move on really to the employee aspect, because a business can do to make sure they're compliant, they need to be able to train their employees to recognise these threats.
Yes.
And often employees are the first line of defence, and if they're not well trained, they can expose that business to the phishing attacks and social engineering that you mentioned. Would you say it's fair to say that most security breaches are caused by employees, and can they be traced back to employee negligence? Would that be a fair assessment in terms of the risk?
I think it would maybe be a bit harsh, and if we kind of reflect back on the conversations that we've had already, we spoke about outdated IT. Well, that's the responsibility of the business. We spoke about lacking IT cybersecurity specialists, not conducting continuous assessments of your cybersecurity readiness, for example. So there are things that are outside of the control of the employee. However, they really do have an essential role in helping to protect a business. And there are a lot of stats out there as well that actually highlight that they are a major area of vulnerability for businesses. It's quite interesting because we've done a lot of research in recent years and recent time in this whole space. And some research that we've done, we did some research focused on employers, and then we've recently conducted some research focused on employees. And there's a little bit of a sort of a gap between the two, which is quite interesting. So when we researched employers, I think it was 4 out of 10 employers saw cybersecurity training for their employees as the biggest weakness or threat to their cybersecurity in their businesses. Yeah, so that's really substantial. And you'd think, well, at least they recognise it. So if you recognise it, then you'll probably do something about it. However, our more recent survey in talking to employees, 1 in 4, 25% of them have not received any cybersecurity training whatsoever. So that's a bit of a mixed kind of message there, and certainly a gap, and one that, and we'll talk about it later, I think, which is probably easier to close than what maybe businesses actually think.
Yeah, that sort of employer-employee gap between cybersecurity training is really interesting, and I think that's one of the challenges with SMBs is that they may be aware of the training, and they recognise the need to be more secure and improve their cybersecurity posture, but the employees either don't have access to the training or they're not aware of the training.
Yes.
And based on that, do you think SMBs are adequately prepared to mitigate these risks, and what kind of training do they need? And you maybe can share some sort of steps they can take to protect their business.
Again, just going back to our research, and when we were talking to the businesses and the business owners and people involved in IT, I think it was something like 2/3 of people involved in procuring IT technology had very low confidence in the business's ability to mitigate security risks. So that's quite a scary statistic. But as I said earlier, actually, there are some quick wins that are available. So if we look at how do we address that skills and competencies need of employees to be able to spot some of these types of cybersecurity attacks. And there is technology that is available now that essentially it's easy to deploy, it's very affordable, and it's easy to use as well. So this is based on software as a service type of technology, which is all around it. We use it every day in our personal lives and in the business life. And it's security awareness training technology. And the way this technology works, and it does use some AI technology as well to improve the user experience and to make them more resilient to attacks and things like that. So, of course, it will provide foundational training that everyone can go through online. You just connect with the app. You go through that online training. But then what the software will also do is it will take the users through simulated phishing attacks, for example, because as we said, they're very common. And by going through these simulations, it helps the users start to learn to spot what a phishing attack might actually look like, or some malware or ransomware and things like that. But that's not the end of it, because I think, as we said a number of times, cybersecurity doesn't stop. There's always a new attack, a different type of attack. So employees have to be vigilant all of the time, but also they need help in spotting new types of attacks. And the great thing is, with these software as a service, security awareness technologies, they will do all of that for you. And as an employer, there's very little that you need to kind of think about. All you need to understand is, are your employees going through the training? How effective are they at that? And are they improving on the learning? And you'll get a dashboard that would describe that for you. So previously, only large enterprises could afford that type of technology, but that's absolutely not the case today. So quite frankly, it's a quick win, and there's no excuse for SMBs not doing that.
Basically, that SaaS model of training makes cybersecurity training more accessible and cost effective, I guess, for SMBs. So, rather than them having to worry about making those big investments in training, they can easily access that. So that's, definitely the key action point that SMBs can take away from this. And in terms of Sharp's IT services, because maybe many of the viewers and listeners may not be aware of Sharp's IT credentials and its IT services business. So can you talk a bit about that business and the kind of services and training that it offers? Yeah,
for sure. So Sharp has been in the B2B marketplace in Europe for many, many, many years, and over that time, we've doing business with many, many tens of thousands of small to medium businesses. So we understand those businesses, and even though we might appear as a large corporation, actually we really do kind of get the local importance that those businesses actually have themselves. And over that time, I think we've become their trusted partner with the services that we've delivered. And more recently, we've gradually been building an IT services business because our customers have been looking for a professional services provider. They can no longer rely on the IT person in the local village or the town who goes on holidays and they're sick and things like that, and actually probably can't even keep up with the pace of change in technology. But as we've said, technology is so important to businesses. It's their lifeblood, that they do need the security of a professional services provider. So Sharp actually has over 30 years of experience providing IT services now to over 1,600 clients across 9 countries in Europe. So that's a lot of experience that we can bring to bear to help new customers as well. And on the theme of what we've been talking about, we have our own security awareness training service that's available, and we're now in the process of extending that across and making it available to all of our customers across Europe. It works in a very similar way to what I described, but it's actually been built for small to medium businesses, not large enterprises. So, for example, when you look at things like the foundational training, it's not made up of kind of monolithic 1-2 hour sessions, learning fatigue. They're made up of sort of micro snippets of learning that might take you 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to go through, and actually doing a number of these over a reasonably short space of time. But it gives people more flexibility as well, because they have their day-to-day jobs to do as well. But then, having conducted that, it also delivers this experiential simulated phishing attacks for the customers, then the ongoing simulated attacks to make sure that the employees are vigilant, they continue to learn, and that, of course, as new threats materialize, the sort of zero-day threats, we will automatically provide simulated attacks actually around that new zero-day threat. So the customer really is at the front end of developments to make sure that they've got maximum protection for their businesses. So beyond that, when we talk about cybersecurity and you look at things like NIS2, for example, it's about detect the threat, defend your business, and restore your business essentially. So from Sharp's point of view, we don't want to just help our customers detect, because actually what you also need to do is prevent. So we have a whole portfolio of IT services related to security, working with some of the industry leading partners as well, like Lenovo, Bitdefender, CyberSmart, and ConnectWise, to help us to do that. Because quite frankly, in this day and age, in the world of IT, I don't think any one company can do everything. So partnering really is critical to adding value to our customers. And then the last bit, we have a range of backup and disaster recovery services in the event that you do actually get a breach, and it could well happen. So then the question is, how quickly can you restore your business back to an operational status?
Yeah, I think it's. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things there, because I think the fact that you're offering this cloud-based security awareness training really helps SMBs make sure that they have improve their cybersecurity posture. But I think the fact you mentioned the learning fatigue, because there can be a certain amount of time that needs to be spent on any cybersecurity training with SMBs. They don't necessarily want to spend all their time, even for large enterprises, it can be quite time dependent. So the fact that you can offer that in sort of snippets, and it's something they can do over a period of time, but it also keeps them updated on the new and emerging threats. So looking ahead in terms of actually those emerging threats, and we mentioned AI earlier, what do you think are the key threats that SMBs need to be aware of, so that they can really stay ahead of the curve?
Yet again, I'm going to talk about AI and Gen AI in particular, which is one of the most revolutionary developments in technology for many years, but not just for business, but for society actually as a whole. It's at the point where not only is it developing, actually, it's the speed of development as well. It's at a breakneck pace, and it's affecting all walks of life in a good way. And I think one of the challenges for businesses, and quite honestly, whether you're a small business or a large enterprise like Sharp, many of us are still trying to kind of figure out What are those use cases for AI? Yeah? How can it help me? Can I actually do all my PR? Can I do my marketing comms just using AI, for example? And it's probably another subject because there's a lot of things you can do, but there's a lot of pitfalls as well if you're not actually careful. How can I automate parts of my business using AI and things like that? So that's all really cool. When we did our most recent survey of employees in small to medium businesses, we asked a question that was related to Gen AI and security, and actually almost a third of them felt that the advent of Gen AI will make actually cyber attacks a lot more difficult to spot. Yeah, and they're absolutely right. So I suppose on one hand, it's good that there is that kind of awareness. But also another data point that they gave us was that they're now a lot more nervous and worried about making a mistake in their day-to-day business activities that will result in some form of cyber attack or cyber breach. And are really anxious about that, which, interesting actually, I mean, that's quite a mental health issue as well, and mental health is really important in this day and age. We're all very aware of it. So, I think from an employer perspective, yes, you've got to protect your business, but I think you should also appreciate that your employees actually are quite anxious about some of these things, and maybe the lack of cyber security training for your employees, at least a quarter of them, haven't received any, and that's causing that anxiety for people.
That's really interesting because, I think because we talked about the potential impact of a cybersecurity breach, and employees are aware of, some the impact this can have. And if they don't have the right training, then they are more anxious about, whether they should click on that email or is it a genuine email. And I think, like you say, that training can address some of those challenges that
I think employers will be pushing on an open door. Their employees want help. They want to be trained. So do it. It's there. It's affordable.
So in terms of the way the Sharp is approaching that, so you deliver this through the channel as well as direct, is that right, for SMBs in terms of the training? In terms of the training,
yes. So we're making a version of the training available for our channel partners as well. And I think, as we probably said earlier, actually, with all these regulations and things coming in, which really does force businesses, hopefully, to look at things like cybersecurity or sustainability in a way they hadn't done before, but they need help. And therefore, that really is an opportunity for the channel as well. And I think we're certainly keen to help our channel partners to offer these types of services. They're going to need help themselves, and we're certainly keen to do that.
Well, it's been really interesting to hear about the real imperative for businesses to have this cyber-aware workforce and the need for more training and access to training. But at the same time, it does sound very overwhelming for SMBs. And I think, it'd be really helpful to maybe if you can recommend 3 key steps that SMBs should take now to take action.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one other point I would just like to make, because we're kind of closing now. So, we've talked about the investment that businesses need to make in protecting their businesses. So it's a cost, it's an overhead, it's a burden. But I think there is another side to that as well, because all businesses are selling to customers. Whether that's another business or whether that's a consumer. And I think increasingly today, customers, when they choose who to buy from, things like sustainability, but also cybersecurity, will actually influence their decision making. Will my data be safe with the supplier that I'm about to buy something from? Because I'm going to give them potentially quite a bit of data, for example. So I think you kind of need to look on that side as well and treat it as a bit of a revenue growth opportunity as well. So that's it. So what are the things? If we look at it from a sort of a people, process, technology point of view, so you've got kind of three things there. Probably process first, actually, which is really about conducting that audit, to understand, no matter how good or how bad it is, but what is the state of your cyber security today? So do that. So you know exactly where you stand. Certainly, you'll then build a plan with things to do. But actually, one of the most important things that you need to do quickly, I think, is educate and train your employees in cybersecurity and some of the things that we've been talking about. And I'm probably sound like a broken record, but it's available, it's easy to do, it's affordable. So do that. Number 2, and then number 3 is about that monitoring, actually, because nothing stands still. So you need to get the monitoring done. There are tools that can help you to do this. So it's not manual. We don't live in the world of manual things now. So use the automated tools. You probably will need some advice. So talk to your managed service provider, because that's their job. That's what they do. And it's not just about selling you technology. Certainly from Sharp's point of view, we really get the value of consultancy and advice to our customers to help them to protect themselves. And the other good news is, while we have all these regulations coming out from the EU and the UK government, actually they do also try and help as well. So there's a lot of learning content available on government websites and things like that around what you need to do to comply with these regulations that are coming out.
Ultimately, it's all about detect, protect and recover. I
Yes,
think they're
exactly.
the three key areas. And as you've explained, cybersecurity training is more accessible now for SMBs, and through Sharp's IT services, cloud-based solutions, it's almost a no-brainer, isn't it, to have those capabilities. So, no, that's been great. It's really been fascinating to sort of understand more about the SMB cybersecurity risk, and the fact that even though they're small companies, cybersecurity can have a huge impact to these businesses, and it can be quite devastating if they do suffer a cyber attack.
I mean, people have put their livelihoods into growing their businesses.
But equally, as you say, it's accessible and affordable to get the training and to make sure their first line of defence employees are educated, but also help protect their business. So thank you so much for sharing those insights today.
I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Louella.
Thank you for joining this episode of In the Spotlight with Quocirca. For more information, please go to quocirca.com, and many thanks again for watching.